Welcome to the 7th and final lecture in the UNC OBGYN Quality Improvement Toolbox lecture series. Today we'll be talking about control charts. A control chart is a tool that helps us answer the question, how will we know that a change is an improvement? It's used in a PDSA cycle as part of the study phase to monitor progress over time. Before we talk about control charts themselves, let's talk about variation. If you recall, a process is any set of steps performed in a particular order to achieve a particular goal. As an example, we could think about the process of measuring blood pressure. Now, every process has some amount of inherent variation. For instance, with blood pressure, if you measure the same patient's blood pressure repeatedly, it's going to be a slightly different number every time. In healthcare processes particularly, three of the big sources of normal or expected variation are variation in the process itself. With blood pressure, for instance, the same nurse repeatedly measuring blood pressure on the same patient will do it slightly differently each time, placing the cuff differently, inflating it differently, etc. Variation in measurement, as in the instrument itself is not 100% precise, and so will give slight variations even if measuring the same thing over and over. And variation in patient physiology. In other words, even without major changes in external stimulus, any living system will fluctuate over time within certain limits as part of homeostasis. All of these kinds of variation are normal and to be expected. Hence the normal distribution that we're also familiar with. The normal distribution for a process means that even considering natural variation in a set of measurements, 99.7% of them should fall within 3 standard deviations of the mean, and that's expected. FYI, this is how they determine the normal ranges for lab values from large populations of healthy people. In the field of statistical process control, a value within 3 standard deviations of the mean is within the range of what's called common cause variation. So this is our normal distribution, and between those 3 standard deviation lines, anything that falls within this range is called common cause variation. Outside of those ranges, we call it special cause variation, and those are values that are truly different. So common cause variation is the natural fluctuation in the measurements that you're taking that is due to the process itself. At the patient level, you could think about this as the fluctuations you would see in the daily temperature readings if you took the temperatures of a healthy population of adults every day. On a system level, it's the week-to-week fluctuation in something like the ventilator-associated pneumonia rates in the ICU. Systems that are exhibiting only common cause variation are in what we call statistical control. In other words, if all you see in your set of data is common cause variation, your process is outputting exactly what it is designed to output. Now, whether it's outputting what you want it to output, that's a totally different question, and we'll get to that later. Special cause variation is something completely different. It is an unnatural variation due to events, changes, or circumstances that have not previously been typical or inherent in your regular process. If 3 standard deviations on either side of the mean account for 99.73% of the values that occur with natural variation, a data point outside of that range has less than a 0.25% chance of being due to natural variation in your system. In other words, if you see a data point like that, it's very unlikely to be normal for your system. For instance, on a patient level, an unusually high temperature due to a fever in a patient means that the patient is sick, not a healthy, normal person. At the system level, if you see an unusually high ventilator-associated pneumonia rate after a new resident comes onto your service in the MICU, maybe it's that the normal process isn't being followed. The normal sterile technique for intubation isn't being followed, for instance. We'll come back to this later. So what is a control chart? It is simply a way to see where your successive data points fall on a bell curve over time. The key components of a control chart are the center line, which corresponds to the mean of your data set, and then the upper control limit and the lower control limit, which correspond to 3 standard deviations above and below the mean. If you remember one thing from this lecture, remember this slide, because if you remember this graphic, you'll be able to remember what those lines on a control chart mean, and most of how to interpret it. Let's look at those components a little more closely. So the center line is the mean of your data set. That one's easy. The upper and lower control limits are set at +3 and -3 standard deviations from the mean of your data set. Now remember, these are going to be used to identify special cause variation in your data set. In other words, they're going to be used to try to identify points that are not due to the normal variation within your process. So where to set these control lines is important. Where you set them essentially sets the sensitivity and specificity of your screening for abnormalities in your data set. If you set those lines closer to your center line or to your mean, it's like having a more sensitive but less specific test. In other words, it's more likely that you'll see a point outside of those lines and will go and investigate it. It's like having a false positive on a test, whereas setting those wider makes finding an abnormal data point outside of those lines less sensitive but more specific. So as a compromise, so that you're not just relying on points outside of 3 standard deviations from your mean to find abnormal data points, many control charts will also include lines at 2 standard deviations from the mean, which can give you a little more guidance. In other words, a little more sensitivity with a little less specificity for looking for abnormal data points. Now that we know what the lines on the control chart mean, let's talk about how to identify special cause variation in your data set. Now keep in mind, these rules are not intended to tell you what is wrong, just that something is wrong in your data set. In other words, these rules are all designed to identify patterns in the data that would be very unlikely to occur by chance if the variation you're seeing in your data set was only due to the normal process or common cause variation. Figuring out what is actually causing these kinds of variation in your process, well, that's up to you to investigate through the tools we've already discussed in this course. The first 4 rules use the mean and the control limits of the control chart to identify trends in the data that would not be likely to occur based on only common cause variation. The first rule is the easiest to remember. We'll call it extreme. This is when one point falls more than 3 standard deviations from the mean. When that happens, the chances are something funny was going on there. In other words, this data point was not due to the normal variation in your process. The second rule we'll call bias. This is when 9 or more points in a row fall on the same side of the mean. This usually indicates that some prolonged source of bias existed in your process for this period of time. If this is sustained over a long period of time, it could mean that something about your process itself may have changed. The next rule we'll call trend. This is where 6 or more points in a row are continually increasing or decreasing. The fourth rule we'll call oscillation. This is when 14 or more points in a row alternate in direction, up, down, up, down, up, down. In other words, no more than 2 points in a row ever create a trend in a single direction. This regular oscillation statistically is unlikely to be due to chance alone. And then there are 4 more rules which are a little more subtle. These use the standard deviation lines at 1 standard deviation and 2 standard deviations on either side of the mean. Rule number 5 we'll call on edge. This is when 2 or 3 out of any 3 points in a row are more than 2 standard deviations from the mean in the same direction. In other words, this is not definitely special cause variation, but there may be a tendency to put points moderately out of control around these parts of your data set. Rule 6 we'll call tendency. This is when 4 or 5 out of any 5 points in a row are more than 1 standard deviation from the mean in the same direction. Again, this is unlikely to occur entirely by chance, but isn't as necessarily strongly indicative of special cause variation as some of our other rules. Rule 7 we'll call blissful ignorance. I love this rule. This is when 15 or more points in a row are all within 1 standard deviation of the mean on either side of the mean. In other words, they don't all have to be on the same side of the mean. The reason that I love this rule is that this is often a subtle clue that a process change may have actually occurred in your process, because you would expect greater variation over time than this demonstrates. So when this occurs, often the answer is that you need to recalculate your standard deviation and limits after you see this occur. And rule number 8 we'll call no middle ground. This is when 8 points in a row exist, none of which fall within one standard deviation of the mean, and the points occur on both directions of the mean. Jumping above and below the mean with no points falling this close to your mean line is rarely random when it happens over this long of a period of time. Okay, that's a lot of rules to remember. I get it. Below the lecture video, there's a link to a memory aid that has all 8 of those rules on it. You can pull that up or print that out, and I want you to do that because we're going to go through a couple of examples now, and I want you to practice trying to figure out which one of those rules each data set violates. Again, you're practicing here to find special cause variation in preparation for looking at your own data sets. Pause the video, and whenever you're ready, proceed to the next slide. So look at this data set. Which of the rules we talked about shows that this process is out of statistical control? If you said rule number 1, extreme, you're right. This one's pretty easy. You can see that there is a point that clearly falls outside of 3 standard deviations of the mean. There's something funny going on there. Now take a look at this control chart. Look at your reference sheet and take a minute to figure out which one of the rules this violates. I'm going to give you a minute here. This data set violates rule number 6, tendency, where 4 out of any 5 consecutive data points falls outside of one standard deviation of the mean on the same side of the mean. In other words, during this part of the data collection, something funny was going on here, probably, to bias those 4 data points to the same side of the mean. Now take a minute to figure out which rule this data set violates. If you want, you can pause the video until you've made your choice. This violates rule number 8, no middle ground, where 8 or more points consecutively do not fall within one standard deviation of the mean. Again, unlikely to occur just by chance alone. Now let's go back to our example case of ventilator-associated pneumonias in the MICU and see how a control chart was used. This is the baseline ventilator-associated pneumonia rate data from the 2 years prior to starting the project. Take a second and look at those 8 rules we just discussed and see if you think this process is in statistical control. Right off the bat, you can see a couple of violations of rule number 1. You can also see some bias where 2 out of 3 consecutive points are more than 2 standard deviations from the mean. And then you can see a long stretch at the end here with a trend. So this is not in statistical control. The question is, what do we do next? Well, with any project like this, we want to eliminate special cause variation to bring our process into statistical control first. When you see a data set like this that violates so many of the different rules in such a small data set, this tends to be a process that's not very standardized, and so you get all kinds of wild swings in the data because a lot of times that process is not really being performed in the same way every time by different providers. Once they saw that their baseline data was not in statistical control, the team made some changes and standardized their process to try to bring it into control and eliminate some causes of special cause variation. A lot of times at the beginning of a project, you do that just by standardizing your process and making sure everyone is doing it basically in the same way, in the same order, and using the same equipment. And for the ventilator-associated pneumonia project, that's what they did, making sure that all the new interns rotating into the MICU each month had basic training in how to do an intubation and how to do it in a certain order with a certain set of equipment in a relatively sterile fashion. So now, after that intervention, which is represented by the vertical dashed line there, for that new data afterwards, is this now in statistical control? Yes, it is. It doesn't violate any of those 8 rules we talked about. So now that we have our process in statistical control, what do we do next? The next step is to introduce special cause variation into our process. Wait, what? Special cause variation can be the result of either an external event beyond your control, or it can be the result of a deliberate intervention When we try to change a process to improve it, we are deliberately trying to introduce some kind of special cause variation into the process and hoping to see a change in the data that violates one of the 8 rules we talked about. Hopefully this will make more sense after you see some examples, but the steps to improving a process using your control chart are to first eliminate special cause variation in order to bring your process into statistical control, and then, after you have a process in statistical control, to deliberately introduce new special cause variation through your interventions, one by one. And each of those interventions are usually aimed at either changing the mean or the center line of your data, or tightening up the upper and lower control limits, in other words, decreasing the variability between the points of your data set. In the case of our ventilator-associated pneumonia project, once the team had gotten rid of special cause variation initially, they then made an intervention, which is represented by the vertical dotted line in this graph. After that intervention, look at that data and tell me if that process is now in statistical control. It's not. You can see if you look at your cheat sheet that we're violating one of our rules. So what happened? This is a perfect example of how if you introduce a change into your process through an intervention, or if you see evidence that you think one has occurred in your control chart, that you have to recalculate your center line and your control limits for the data after that process change, because you're no longer measuring the same process as you were before. Your old process, and therefore your old mean and control limits, no longer apply to your new data. When the team did that for the data after this intervention, they recalculated their mean and their upper and lower control limits. And now you can see that that new data is also in statistical control. I've now added another year's worth of data to the control chart for this project. Can you see any place in this control chart where something looks funny? You're probably seeing right here. What do you think happened here? If you said a process change probably happened there, you're right. And now what do we need to do? We need to recalculate our center line and control limits after that process change so that we can see if our new data is in statistical control. And you can see here that it is. But it's important to do that because unless you do, you can't know whether any of those new points of data are outside of 3 standard deviations from your mean, or if any of the series of data points violate any of the other 7 rules that we talked about. But once you do that, you can see that, everything is right. And this slide shows what happened after a third intervention, where the rate of the ventilator-associated pneumonias fell to 0, and so the upper and lower control limits were so tight that they were in fact non-existent on either side of the mean line. So those were all example charts that I had made for the purposes of letting you see what's supposed to happen after consecutive interventions and how to identify the need for changing your control limits. This is the actual control chart that they made for this project. As you can see, the numbers were much lower to start with than I was using in my examples. But what you can see is after they made an intervention and recalculated their mean and control limits, the new process was in statistical control, and the upper and lower control limits were extremely tight, and basically right around 0. In review, a control chart is a tool to help you track your data over time to determine if your interventions result in measurable changes in your process. The center line is the mean of your data set, and the upper and lower control limits represent plus and minus 3 standard deviations from the mean. You can use the cheat sheet that I provided to monitor your data for evidence of special cause variation, which may indicate that something is changed or needs to be changed with your process. Why do I need to change my process at all? Well, again, if you don't see any special cause variation in your process, that means that your process is in statistical control. In other words, your process is outputting exactly what it is designed to output. So without changing anything, you shouldn't expect better outcomes than what you're already getting. I think this is a great quote from one of the big quality and safety journals in healthcare. The control chart defines what a process is capable of producing given its current design and operation. And now it is time for your class to go forth and complete your project. Get together, and as you gather data from each of your PDSA cycles, plotted on a control chart so that you can monitor your progress over time. This will help you see not only if each of your interventions has the effect that you want it to, but also if your interventions are getting you closer to meeting the aim that you set out to achieve at the beginning. Have the person from your class who is in charge of your data collection contact me. It can be a real pain to make control charts by hand, or even by hand in Excel, but I have some Excel tools for creating control charts that I can give you that can make it much faster and easier than doing it by hand. Thank you for completing all 7 of the lectures. I really appreciate everyone's participation and attention, and I can't wait to see what each of the classes does with their projects at Resident Research Day. Good luck, and as always, please contact me by cell, email, or text if you have any questions or need any help. Thanks again.